The kid behind the counter flipped through the rolled and folded maps in the box the way a man flips through old newspapers in a recycling bin, pulling one out, glancing at it, dropping it back, and closed the flaps. "Yeah, old maps. We don't really take maps, man. I can do $10 for the box." Glenn Shiflett stood on the other side of the counter, 81 years old, the faded tan Virginia Department of Transportation cap he'd worn since retirement pulled low over his eyes, the cardboard box of his father's maps sitting on the glass between them, and watched a 23-year-old in a Valley Pawn polo look at 40 years of his father's collecting and see $10 worth of paper. "Those were my daddy's," Glenn said, quiet. The kid, Rhett by the crooked name tag, shrugged and pushed the box an inch across the glass with the flat of his hand. "Sure, 10. Final. Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew." The cardboard box contained approximately 60 maps, USGS topographic quadrangles, Virginia State Highway maps, old Rand McNally road atlases, a few hand-drawn plat maps from local estates, and a collection of AA road maps from the 1960s that Glenn's father had saved because he'd driven every road on them. Most were worth nothing. A few of the older USGS topos, the ones from the 1890s, might bring $5 to $10 apiece from the right buyer. But one map, folded flat between two 1965 AAA road maps of the Shenandoah Valley at the very bottom of the box, was not a road map. It was not a topographic quadrangle. It was not anything that had been printed by a press. It was a single large sheet of heavy rag paper, approximately 18 by 24 inches, with hand-drawn survey lines in brown iron gall ink, compass bearings noted in degrees and minutes, distances marked in chains and poles, a north arrow drawn freehand, and, in the lower right corner, in a handwriting that the expert would recognize within 3 seconds of seeing it, a notation. "Surveyed for Mr. Brian Martin, 400 acres on the Cacapon River, by G. Washington Surveyor, March 17, 1750. George Washington." The first president of the United States had been, before he was a soldier, before he was a general, before he was a president, a surveyor. At the age of 16, in 1748, Washington had joined a surveying expedition into the Shenandoah Valley, led by George William Fairfax, on behalf of Lord Thomas Fairfax, the largest landowner in colonial Virginia. Washington had spent the next 4 years, from 1748 to 1752, surveying the frontier lands of the Shenandoah Valley and the South Branch of the Potomac for Lord Fairfax and for private clients. He had drawn hundreds of survey plats, field maps showing the boundaries, bearings, and acreage of the tracts he measured. These surveys were Washington's first profession. They were the work that taught him to read terrain, to navigate wilderness, and to understand land. Skills that would later make him the general who chose the ground at Valley Forge and the president who chose the ground for the Capitol. Washington's survey plats were among the most valuable American documents in existence. The Library of Congress held the largest collection. A handful were in private collections. The last Washington manuscript survey to surface at auction, a plat of a tract near Winchester, had sold at Freeman's in Philadelphia in 2021 for $128,000. Glenn's father, Boyd Shiflett, had bought the map at a flea market on the grounds of the old Winchester Drive-In on Valley Avenue in 1978. He had paid $5. He had assumed it was a reproduction, a nice one on old-looking paper, probably made for a bicentennial souvenir in 1976, and he had filed it in the box with his other maps and had never thought about it again. It was not a reproduction. This is the story of how Glenn Shiflett walked into Valley Pawn on a Wednesday morning in February with $470 of trouble in his head and walked out with the discovery that the $5 flea market map his father had filed between two ADA road maps, the one Boyd had assumed was a bicentennial copy, was a 274-year-old manuscript survey drawn by the hand of George Washington at the age of 17 in the valley where Glenn had lived his entire life. Before I tell you what happened when the expert walked through that door, If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Glenn. Glenn Boyd Shiflett was born in 1943 in Winchester, Virginia. His father, Boyd Shiflett, had been a surveyor, the Frederick County Surveyor, for 31 years, from 1952 to 1983, the man who walked the property lines and set the corners and drew the plats for every piece of land that changed hands in the county for 3 decades. His mother, Reva, had worked the front desk at the Winchester Medical Center for 28 years. Glenn went to Handley High, graduated in 1961, did 4 years in the Army, 2 at Fort Belvoir in the Engineers, 2 in Vietnam, came home and spent 34 years as a survey technician for the Virginia Department of Transportation, running rod and chain on highway projects from the Valley to the Tidewater. Married Patsy Cline. No relation, but she'd heard the jokes her whole life. In 1967. One son, Boyd, named for Glenn's father, now 55 and living in Stevens City, 10 miles south. Patsy had died in 2022 of a heart attack on a Saturday morning in the garden, kneeling beside the tomato cages, gone before Glenn could reach her. The truck was the problem. The 2002 Ford Ranger, the truck Glenn had driven to every VDOT survey site for the last 7 years of his career, had thrown a rod bearing in January. The mechanic at Whitaker's on Jubal Early Drive had quoted $470 for a short block rebuild. Without the truck, Glenn couldn't get to the VA in Martinsburg or to the Food Lion or to Braddock Street United Methodist, where he'd been an usher for 29 years. His VDOT pension was $1,350 a month. Social Security added $2,100. After property taxes, insurance, electric, gas, his blood pressure and prostate medications, and groceries, he had about $85 of slack in a good month. He did not have $470. He could have called Boyd in Stevens City. Boyd was a corrections officer at the Northwestern Regional Adult Detention Center with 3 kids, the oldest starting at Shenandoah University in the fall. Glenn had not asked his son for $1 in 16 years. He was not going to start over a rod bearing. For 12 days, he caught rides to church with his neighbor Carl Whitmore and walked the half-mile to the Food Lion and missed 1 VA appointment. On the 13th morning, Wednesday, he went to the basement. The box of maps was on the metal shelving unit beside the workbench. It had been there since 2005 when Glenn had brought it home from his parents' house after his mother died. Boyd Shiflett, Glenn's father, the county surveyor, had collected maps the way surveyors collect maps, compulsively, indiscriminately, and with the conviction that every map tells a story about the ground. Boyd had bought maps at flea markets, estate sales, antique shops, yard sales, and the Goodwill on Valley Avenue. He had bought USGS topos for $0.25 apiece. He had bought old highway maps for $0.10. He had bought hand-drawn plats from estate boxes for $1. He had filed them all in a single cardboard box without organization, without labels, without any system at all. Just maps on top of maps, the way a man who loved maps kept maps. Boyd had told Glenn about his map collection exactly once, in 1983, the year he retired from the county. "I've got 60 years of maps in that box," Boyd had said. "Every flea market in the valley. Some of them are nice. There's some old USGS quads in there that show roads that don't exist anymore. And there's one, I bought it at the Winchester Drive-In Flea Market in '78. It's a survey plat, looks old, real nice handwriting. I think it's a bicentennial reproduction, but it's pretty. $5. Glenn had nodded. He had been 40. He had not thought about it again. Boyd Shiflett had been the kind of man who knew land. He had walked every property line in Frederick County. He had set corners on farms that had been in the same families since the 18th century. He had known the terrain of the Shenandoah Valley the way a riverboat captain knows a river, by instinct, by memory, by the feel of the ground under his boots. But Boyd had not been a historian. He had not been a collector in the scholarly sense. He had been a man who liked maps because maps were what he did. And when he found one at a flea market that looked interesting, He bought it and put it in the box with the others. The survey plat at the bottom of the box, the one Boyd had paid $5 for in 1978, had been in the box for 46 years. Glenn sat at the kitchen table that Wednesday morning with the box on the floor beside his chair and the mechanic's estimate beside his coffee mug, and he did something he'd sworn he would never do. He put the box in Carl Whitmore's truck and drove to town. Valley Pawn sat on South Loudoun Street between a pizza place and a Cricket Wireless. The bell jangled as Glenn stepped inside. Rhett was behind the counter on his phone and looked up after about 8 seconds. "Help you?" "I've got a box of old maps, my daddy's. He was a surveyor." "Maps?" Rhett made a face. "We don't really take maps. What kind of maps?" "All kinds. Road maps, topographic maps, some old survey plats." "Let's see 'em." Glenn set the box on the glass. Rhett opened the flaps and flipped through the maps, pulling one out, glancing at it, dropping it back. A USGS quad, a Rand McNally, a Virginia highway map from 1971. He didn't unfold anything. He didn't read anything. He flipped through them the way a man checks a stack of old magazines for anything with a cover worth framing. "Yeah, old maps. Nobody wants maps, man. GPS killed maps. $10 for the box, maybe 15 if there's something cool in there. Some of those are from the 1890s, the topographic..." "Sure, Pops." Rhett closed the flaps. He drummed his fingers on the top. 10. Take it or leave it." Glenn's hands were flat on the counter. His jaw was tight. He thought about the truck. He thought about Patsy in the garden. He thought about his father at the kitchen table in 1983, sorting through the box, holding up maps one at a time, saying this one shows the old Valley Turnpike before they built the 81, and this one has the mill race on Opequon Creek that's been gone since '54. He did not pick up the box. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 23-year-old. And Glenn Shiflett had not cried in front of another human being since Patsy's funeral in 2022. The bell over the door jangled again. A woman came in, late 50s, medium height, with shoulder-length brown hair going gray, strong features, and warm brown eyes behind half-moon reading glasses on a beaded chain. She wore a dark green quilted vest over a white Oxford shirt and khaki trousers, brown leather walking shoes, and carried a brown canvas messenger bag with a Virginia Museum of History and Culture patch sewn on the flap. She came 2 steps inside, glanced at the counter, and stopped. She looked at the box. She tilted her head. She read the word MAPS written on the side of the box in Boyd's block print. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was warm and direct, with the unhurried cadence of Tidewater, Virginia. "Sir, is that a box of old maps?" Rhett looked up. "Old guy's selling. $10. The woman did not look at Rhett. She looked at Glenn. "Sir, my name is Dr. Ann Westcott. I am the Senior Curator of Cartographic Collections at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond. I also consult for Freeman's Auction House in Philadelphia. They handle most significant American manuscript maps. I am in Winchester this week because we are cataloging a private collection of 18th century Shenandoah Valley land records at the Handley Regional Library. I stopped in here because I always stop in pawn shops in the valley. This part of Virginia has more colonial-era documents per acre than anywhere in the state. Would you permit me to look through that box?" Glenn found his voice. "You're asking me. It's yours, isn't it?" "It was my daddy's. He was the county surveyor." Dr. Westcott's eyes sharpened. "Your father was a surveyor?" "Frederick County, 31 years. "Then yes, sir. I would very much like to look through this box." Rhett stepped back. "Doctor?" Westcott set her messenger bag on the counter and opened it. She drew out a pair of thin white cotton handling gloves, a 10x jeweler's loop, a small LED pen light, a soft chamois, and a leather-bound notebook. She pulled the gloves on finger by finger. "May I?" Glenn nodded. Dr. Westcott went through the box methodically, not flipping, not skimming, but lifting each map by its edges, reading the title, reading the date, setting it on the chamois. She was quick but careful. USGS Staunton Quadrangle, 1894. Nice. $10 to $15. Virginia Highway Map, 1971. $1. Rand McNally Road Atlas, 1963. Nothing. AA Shenandoah Valley, 1965. Nothing. She worked her way down, map by map. The box was deep. 40 years of Boyd's flea market finds, filed without order, the older maps naturally settling to the bottom under the weight of the newer ones on top. She reached the bottom layer. The 1960s AAA road maps, 2 of them, folded in the standard AAA trifold, sitting flat. Between them, between the 2 road maps sandwiched like a bookmark, was a larger sheet of paper, folded twice. Dr. Westcott lifted the folded sheet with both gloved hands. It was heavier than the road maps, heavier paper, thicker. She could feel the weight. She set the road maps aside. She set the folded sheet on the chamois. She unfolded it once. The paper was cream-colored, not white, not yellow, but the deep, warm cream of rag paper that had been made from linen and cotton fiber, not wood pulp. Rag paper, pre-industrial paper, the kind of paper that had been used in America before approximately 1850. She unfolded it a second time. The full sheet was approximately 18 by 24 inches. On the sheet, drawn in brown iron gall ink in a confident angular hand, were survey lines, straight lines connecting numbered stations, with compass bearings noted at each turn in degrees and minutes, distances marked in chains and poles, a creek drawn as a wavy line along one side, and a freehand north arrow in the upper left corner. The lines enclosed an irregular polygon, a tract of land. Inside the polygon, in the same angular hand, was a notation of acreage, 400 acres. In the lower right corner, in the same hand, surveyed for Mr. Brian Martin, 400 acres on the Cacapon River, by G. Washington Surveyor, March 17, 1750. Dr. Westcott set the map on the chamois. She did not move. She did not breathe, as far as Glenn could tell. She stood with both gloved hands flat on the counter and the map spread open in front of her, and she stared at the inscription in the lower right corner for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, very quietly, almost to herself, "Oh no." She picked up the loop. She read the inscription through the lens. She read the handwriting, the angular, confident strokes, the characteristic long-tailed G, the distinctive capital W. She moved the loop across the map, reading the bearing notations, the distance figures, the creek delineation. She held the LED pen light at a grazing angle across the paper surface and read the ink, the brown color, the way it had sunk into the rag fibers over 2.5 centuries. She set the loop down. She took off her reading glasses. She put them back on. She took out her phone. "Mr. Shiflett, Glenn Shiflett. Mr. Shiflett, I need to make a phone call, may I?" Glenn nodded, confused. Dr. Westcott dialed a number. She waited. Someone answered. She said, in a voice that was no longer warm and unhurried, but tight and precise, "David, this is Ann Westcott. I am standing in a pawn shop in Winchester, Virginia. I am looking at a manuscript survey plat on rag paper, iron gall ink, bearing the inscription, 'Surveyed for Brian Martin, 400 acres on the Cacapon River, by G. Washington Surveyor, March 17, 1750. The handwriting is consistent, the paper is consistent, the ink is consistent. I need you to get on a plane." She hung up. She looked at Glenn. "Mr. Shiflett, the person I just called is Dr. David Ferriero, the former archivist of the United States and a consultant for Freeman's Auction House. He is the leading authority on George Washington's manuscript documents." She paused. "Mr. Shiflett, George Washington, before he was a soldier, before he was a general, before he was the President of the United States, was a surveyor. He began surveying at the age of 16 in 1748, when he joined an expedition into the Shenandoah Valley led by George William Fairfax on behalf of Lord Thomas Fairfax. From 1748 to 1752, Washington surveyed the frontier lands of the Shenandoah Valley and the South Branch of the Potomac, the valley where you and I are standing right now. He drew hundreds of survey plats. These plats, in Washington's own hand with his own bearing notations and acreage calculations, are among the most valuable American documents in existence. The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. The handwriting on this map, Mr. Shiflett, is consistent with documented examples of George Washington's hand from the late 1740s and early 1750s. The angular script, the long-tailed lowercase g, the distinctive capital W. The bearing notations in degrees and minutes. Washington used a specific notation style that is well documented. The paper is rag, pre-industrial, consistent with mid-18th century Virginia paper stock. The ink is iron gall, brown from oxidation, consistent with the period. She looked at the map. Bryan Martin was a cousin of Lord Fairfax and a significant landholder in what is now Hampshire County, West Virginia. The Cacapon River is approximately 40 miles southwest of where we are standing. Washington is documented in the Fairfax papers as having surveyed tracts along the Cacapon for Martin and other Fairfax clients in the spring of 1750 when Washington was 17 years old. She paused. Mr. Shiflett, if this map is authenticated, and I believe it will be, it is an original George Washington manuscript survey plat, drawn by Washington's own hand at the age of 17 in the valley where your father spent 31 years as the county surveyor. Rhett had not moved. His phone was face down. His gold stud earring caught the fluorescent light. The last Washington manuscript survey plat to surface at auction, a plat of a tract near Winchester, drawn in 1749, sold at Freeman's in Philadelphia in 2021 for $128,000. This map, a larger plat, with more detailed bearing notations and creek delineation, and with the additional historical significance of a Cacapon River location where Washington is documented, but from which no survey plat had previously been found, at professional appraisal through Freeman's, with authentication from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and independent handwriting analysis, would be valued between $120,000 and $155,000. Conservative estimate, $136,000. Rhett made a sound. I was going to say 20. For the whole box. I meant 20. Glenn didn't look at him. He was looking at the map on the chamois, the brown ink survey lines, the compass bearings, the Cacapon River drawn as a wavy line, the inscription in the lower right corner, by G. Washington, Surveyor. And he was thinking about two surveyors. He was thinking about a 17-year-old boy named George Washington standing on the bank of the Cacapon River in March of 1750 with a compass and a chain and a sheet of rag paper, laying out a 400-acre tract for a man named Bryan Martin. And he was thinking about Boyd Shiflett, the Frederick County surveyor, standing on the grounds of the Winchester Drive-In Flea Market in 1978 with a $5 bill in his hand, picking up a folded sheet of heavy paper from a table of old maps and thinking that's a nice reproduction. Two surveyors, 228 years apart, in the same valley, looking at the same ground. Boyd had held George Washington's survey plat in his hands and had not recognized it. Not because Boyd was ignorant, not because Boyd didn't know maps, but because Boyd was a working surveyor, not a historian, and working surveyors do not expect to find George Washington at a flea market. Boyd had looked at the map and seen good handwriting on old-looking paper, and had thought bicentennial reproduction, because that was the reasonable explanation, and Boyd was a reasonable man. But Boyd had kept it. He had not thrown it away. He had filed it in the box with his other maps, between two AAA road maps of the Shenandoah Valley, and the box had sat on the metal shelving in the basement for 46 years, and George Washington's handwriting had waited, folded flat, for someone to unfold it and read it and know what they were looking at. "My daddy bought that map for $5, Glenn said. His voice was not steady. He thought it was a reproduction. Doctor. Westcott looked at him for a long moment. Your father was a surveyor, Mr. Shiflett. He recognized good survey work when he saw it. He just didn't know how good. Dr. Westcott handed Glenn her card. Mr. Shiflett, take your time. Talk to your son. But please, sir, Do not leave this map or this box in this shop. And please do not refold the map. Rag paper holds folds for centuries. Every fold weakens the fiber. Lay it flat between 2 sheets of acid-free tissue if you can find some. If not, lay it flat between 2 clean cotton dish towels. And do not, please, do not touch the inscription. The iron gall ink is stable, but the surface should not be handled. Glenn nodded. He watched Dr. Westcott lay the map flat on the chamois, then carefully slide it between 2 sheets of acid-free tissue she produced from her messenger bag. She set the protected map on top of the other maps in the box. Glenn took the box in both hands. He nodded once at Dr. Westcott. He walked out past Rhett without a word. In the parking lot, sitting in Carl Whitmore's truck with the February cold pressing through the glass, Glenn Shiflett held the box on his lap and cried for the first time since Patsy's funeral. He called Boyd that night. Boyd drove up from Stevens City the next morning. They sat at the kitchen table on Fairfax Lane with the map spread flat between 2 dish towels. Glenn didn't have acid-free tissue, and Glenn told him the whole story. Boyd Jr., who had been named for a grandfather who had surveyed every property line in Frederick County, looked at the map and said, "Grandpa Boyd held this. He held a George Washington survey plat in his hands." "For $5, Glenn said, "at a flea market." At the drive-in. Boyd Jr. looked at the inscription for a long time. By G. Washington, surveyor. He was a corrections officer, not a surveyor, but he had grown up watching his grandfather set corners and walk lines, and he knew what a survey plat looked like, and he knew this one was drawn by a hand that understood the ground. "2 surveyors," Boyd Jr. said. "Grandpa Boyd and George Washington, same valley." "Same valley," Glenn said. They called Dr. Westcott at 9. Freeman's auction house sent a document specialist and a handwriting analyst to Winchester in March. The rag paper was tested, linen cotton fiber, consistent with mid-18th century Virginia paper mills. The iron gall ink was analyzed. The iron to gallatanic ratio matched documented Washington-era inks. The handwriting was compared against 47 known Washington survey plats at the Library of Congress. The angular script matched, the long-tailed G matched, the capital W matched, the bearing notation style matched. The survey itself was verified against the Fairfax estate records in the Virginia State Library. Brian Martin's Cacapon River tract appeared in the Fairfax rent rolls for 1750. Authentication was unanimous. Freeman's listed the map in their April Americana sale. Bidding opened at $60,000. It closed at $131,000. After commission, the Shiflett family received $113,800. Glenn paid for the truck. He paid the property taxes 3 years forward. He had the kitchen repainted. Patsy had chosen a color in 2021, and Glenn had never gotten around to it. He sent Boyd $25,000 and told him to use it for the girls' tuition. He set up a trust for his 3 grandchildren. He bought Patsy a new headstone with her full name and a line beneath that read, "Wife, Mother. She walked the valley with me." He kept the rest of the maps, the USGS topos, the highway maps, the Rand McNally's, the AAA road maps, Boyd's 40-year collection minus the 1 sheet that turned out to be George Washington's. Glenn put the box back on the metal shelving in the basement. He has not opened it again. The maps are Boyd's. They belong in the box, on the shelf, in the basement where Boyd put them. The Washington plat is gone, sold, authenticated, framed, hung in a private collection somewhere Glenn does not know. But the box is still there. And the empty space between the 2 AAA road maps where the Washington plat used to be folded is still there. The Winchester Star ran the story on a Wednesday. The Richmond Times-Dispatch picked it up. The Washington Post ran a feature in the style section about Washington's early surveying career, using the Shiflett plat as the lead example. Mount Vernon, Washington's estate, now a museum, requested permission to display a high-resolution reproduction of the plat beside their exhibit on Washington's surveying instruments. A letter came to Glenn's post office box in June. It was from a 75-year-old woman in Romney, West Virginia, the county seat of Hampshire County on the south branch of the Potomac, near the Cacapon River tract Washington had surveyed. Her name was Virginia Fairfax Martin. She was a direct descendant of Bryan Martin, the man whose 400 acres Washington had surveyed in March of 1750. She wrote that her family had lived on that land continuously since 1750, 274 years. The farm was still there. The Cacapon River still ran along the western boundary, exactly where Washington had drawn it. She wrote that she had walked the property lines her whole life. She wrote that the fence posts on the north boundary still followed, within 6 feet, the compass bearing Washington had recorded north 42 degrees west, 128 poles, 274 years, and the line held. Glenn drove to Romney on a Saturday in July. He stood on the bank of the Cacapon River, the same bank where George Washington had stood at 17, holding a compass and a chain, and looked at the ground Washington had measured. The river was the same river, the hills were the same hills, the survey line was the same line. Boyd Shiflett had spent 31 years walking the property lines of Frederick County, Virginia. George Washington had spent 4 years walking the property lines of the Shenandoah Valley. They had both known the same ground. They had both measured it with the same tools: compass, chain, paper, ink. They had both drawn the lines that told the land where it belonged and the people where they stood. And one of them had filed the other's work in a cardboard box between 2 AAA road maps, and had never known it was there. And the next Saturday morning, back home in Winchester, Glenn sat down at his usual booth at the Snow White Grill on Loudoun Street with his 2 oldest friends, Donnie Klein and Junior Barley, the way he had every Saturday for 25 years. Donnie looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. "Heard you made the Star, Glenn." "Heard that." "George Washington, huh?" "George Washington." Junior shook his head. $10. $10, Glenn agreed. The 3 of them laughed, the quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. A kid in a pawn shop looked at that box of maps and said $10. He didn't know. They never do. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, because some things have hidden worth.